Yilin Wang is a writer, a poet, and Chinese English translator. Her writing has appeared in Clark's World, Fantasy Magazine, the Malahat Review, Grain, CB2, the Ex-Puritan, the Toronto Star, the Tyee, Words Without Borders, and elsewhere. She's the editor and translator of The Lantern and Night Moths, which was published by Invisible Publishing in 2024. She's won the Foster Poetry Prize and Dwarf Stars Award. She's been a finalist for Canada's National Magazine Award and the CBC Poetry Prize. Yilin has an MFA in creative writing from UBC, and The Lantern and the Light Moths has received some outstanding reviews. On October 25th, Yilin will be on a panel of translators at the Vancouver Writers' Fest. She'll be joined by George McWhirter and Michelle Winters at 10 a.m. on the review stage. Thanks for joining me, Yilin.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I'll get to your book in a moment, but first, I'm curious to learn more about you. How did you first become interested in poetry and literature?
So I've always been interested in poetry since I was a child. I grew up with my maternal grandparents, and my grandpa used to tell me stories from Chinese literature, as well as kind of help me kind of recite and learn classical Chinese poetry. And then later on, when my family moved to Canada, I became interested in writing in English, and I started writing in high school and haven't stopped since.
And at what point did you decide to devote yourself to writing and editing in a serious way, like you're doing now?
I started freelancing in grade 12, writing for some kind of Canadian publications, and started getting paid for it, and started kind of sending work out. So I would consider that to be kind of maybe the turning point for when I really started becoming interested in kind of pursuing writing. And I then went and studied creative writing at UBC. And I got into translation more recently, like in the past 5 years or so.
And what led you into translation?
I was in my MFA program at UBC, and I was starting to realize, maybe kind of I should have realized earlier, but I started realizing that a lot of the literature that I read and was exposed to was very kind of Eurocentric and really focused on kind of the Western canon. Despite the fact that, I am bilingual and grew up bilingual and have been kind of exposed to Chinese literature since I was quite young. It wasn't really being taught in the classroom. It wasn't really kind of widely known or kind of discussed in the writing community. And I wasn't really kind of tapping into that for inspiration or kind of my creative practice. So I started consciously seeking out more works in translation and reading more Chinese literature. And I also started noticing that there's a trend where a lot of Chinese literature, especially classical works, have been translated by sinologists, often kind of white folks with more of a removed clinical anthropological kind of relationship with language, as opposed to like lived experience and kind of heritage connections. So I became interested in trying translation myself as a writer.
That's fascinating because I've run the traditional Chinese or the simplified into English when I've been communicating with people from Asia, and it's never as clean in the translation through Google as French or Spanish. And it makes me wonder, language is a complicated thing sometimes. And what are some of the challenges that arise when translating Chinese poetry in particular, which is so dependent on language, into English?
Yeah, so first of all, machine translation and kind of Google Translate tend to kind of fail spectacularly when it comes to any kind of literary translation, I would say, especially from kind of Chinese. And like first we have the linguistic differences. In terms of poetry written in Chinese, it's often more concise, it's full of allusions and idioms. The grammatical, syntactical structures are different. Chinese is also a language that doesn't have like tense. in the same way that English does. It's a language that can often like omit the subject or omit kind of certain prepositional phrases or kind of, so there are many ways it's kind of ambiguous and different from English, and that all kind of present challenges to a translator in terms of kind of rendering it into English. And then poetry in particular is always, really focused as well on kind of word choice and style and the emotional experience. So conveying that and the subtext and ambiguities and kind of the experience of reading the poem, as opposed to just like a literal kind of word by word translation, that is really important as well. And I consider that a lot when I'm kind of translating the poetic techniques and the style, and again, the experience of kind of reading it versus just the literal words.
So it sounds like you're trying to capture the feeling and the mood and all of those things, which doesn't really work in a word for word situation. That's fascinating. So you selected 5 modern and contemporary poets to translate in The Lantern and the Light Moths. What is it about these poets that drew you to their work?
So a lot of poetry that's been translated from Chinese, there's tends to be a focus on the classical tradition, like famous Tang Dynasty poets, Li Bai, Du Fu. Like many people in the Sino diaspora, maybe if they went to Chinese school, they know, the poem about Li Bai and the moon. It's like a famous poem. And I wanted to give folks like a sense of kind of contemporary and modern Chinese poetry. And I specifically wanted to give folks like a range of different kind of styles and different themes. So I picked poets who spoke to me personally. Each of them are kind of favorite poets of mine, I would say, from kind of the past century or so. But they vary a lot in terms of their styles and their kind of themes. At the same time, a lot of the themes are things I would say kind of would speak, I think, to the diaspora, representations about kind of one's longing for home and kind of one's relationship with kind of the homeland and heritage and ancestry, social political issues, Taoism, Buddhism, cultural kind of traditions and illusions, feminism and kind of gender representation. So that's to give you like a sense of the kinds of subjects that they handle. And I also wanted to make sure that I kind of represent kind of women's poetry, because that's a tradition that's also kind of been overlooked as well traditionally, due to kind of women in history often lacking access to education and kind of being erased when it comes to the kind of publishing world. So I was considering all these kind of factors, and I also wanted to give some poets who are kind of more well-known, who are kind of icons in terms of kind of modernism, and other poets who are kind of, I would consider to be kind of new and emerging, but doing really, really interesting and innovative work.
And you began, first poet was the only one born in the 19th century. And I'm wondering, why was it important to start in that way?
I was thinking about her work as a translator when I was arranging the poems, and she wrote a lot about this longing for like a kindred spirit, Ziying, which is literally like the one who understands your music, the one who understands your songs. And I felt that the idea of kind of speaking with and longing for a kindred spirit is in a way also connected to the art of translation. It's often a dialogue with the poet I'm translating, whether they have passed or they're living. And it's also a dialogue with the reader, and it's a dialogue that crosses kind of languages and cultures and borders. So I was thinking a lot about that theme, this longing for a kindred spirit and this kind of connection through arts and kind of language. And that's something that kind of then emerged, I think, kind of throughout the rest of the collection. So I kind of put her work first. And then something else is that she's a poet a very important kind of feminist poet in Chinese history who I've been translating. And there was something that actually happened during my translation process when I was working on the book, which was some of my translations of her poetry were stolen by the British Museum and used without permission and credits. And there was a whole kind of incident that happened that was very widely reported in international media. So that also kind of really affected me emotionally, since I was in the midst of finishing the translations in the book when that happened. And a lot of people ended up finding out about my work through that incident.
Interesting. And from there, you went to the most recently born poet, Zhang, and I'll try the surname. Is it Kaohe or Kaohe or but it was born in 1978. And what would you like people to know about this poet?
Yeah, so
Yilin?
Zhang Xiaohui, she is a poet who is a contemporary poet, and she is also an art gallery curator in China. She's part of the new generation of poets that have kind of emerged from the most recent past few kind of decades. And her work often kind of taps into themes around kind of matrilineal history and relationship with hometowns and heritage languages and the preservation of history in the face of kind of rapid modernization and gentrification. So I found that kind of really fascinating and relatable as someone who grew up in the diaspora. And even though she herself didn't have the experience of living overseas, I felt like the themes that she tapped into are very kind of evocative, and they're also very common in Chinese poetry. And so I wanted to highlight her work.
That's wonderful. And what stands out for you about the three other poets in the Lantern and the Light Moths?
Yeah, so after Zhang Qiaohui's work, I included three other modern contemporary poets. Fei Ming, who was known as a modernist poet working in the 30s and 40s. He was kind of overlooked during his lifetime, despite being very influential on the more recent generations of modern Chinese poets. And he was known as like a very elusive poet, someone who was very difficult to understand. So I was very fascinated by his work, but also really struggled to translate it. And translating his work allowed me to discuss issues of ambiguity and kind of silences in Chinese poetry. And then Xiao Xi is another contemporary female poet, part of Zhang Xiaohui's generation as well. Xiao Xi uses very kind of simple, sometimes whimsical, humorous kind of language to often write about kind of social political issues, as well as kind of offer kind of commentary on contemporary Chinese society. And I found that kind of really innovative and very kind of thought-provoking. And I'm in the process of translating more of her work. And then finally, Dai Wangsu, the last poet, was himself a translator and also one of the most well-known modernist poets. Sorry, he was one of the most famous modernist poets. And he traveled extensively in Europe and translated many modern English and other kinds of poetry into Chinese, which then really contributed to kind of China's exposure to kind of Western literature and Western poetry, and inspired the many Chinese poets at the time who were just starting to have early encounters with European.
Yilin, can I ask where these poets lived? Obviously, China's this huge country, and were they all in Beijing or Shanghai, or
They're
were they
scattered
spread
all
all over
over
the country? Yeah,
in all many different regions.
interesting.
Yeah.
And what did you deliberately set out to do that, to have poets from different regions, or did it just kind of work out that way?
I think it just worked out that way because it's a big country, and
Yeah.
naturally, many of the poets ended up kind of living in different places and traveling, and yeah.
And what does your book say about modern Chinese poetry? If you kind of step back and look at it, from 30,000 feet above.
I guess I wanted to kind of show just kind of how modern Chinese kind of poetry kind of came to be and emerged and capture that moment through some of the earlier poets, as well as how it is now. And some of the kind of common themes that I mentioned that appear, as well as kind of its relevance to the diaspora and to Anglophone poetry as well, in the sense that it was a conversation sometimes, because many of the poets were also influenced by kind of European poetry or by kind of aesthetics from classical Chinese poetry that have also influenced Western poets.
And at Vancouver, we're publishing a series of articles that we're trying to provide a more nuanced picture of people with Chinese ancestry in the region. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how your book might address misconceptions or stereotypes of China or Chinese people.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons why I got into translation was because of some concerns around cultural appropriation or kind of mistranslations or just translation approaches that I feel are kind of too academic and don't really capture kind of the poetic beauty of the language. So what I'm kind of working on through this book and my work in general is to try to kind of show the poetics, the beauty, the complexity of Chinese poetry in terms of the range of poems out there and styles, as well as talk about the craft of translation itself, some of the ethics, some of the challenges, some of the ways of thinking about translation, not just as a purely kind of academic pursuit or as purely kind of swapping words for one another, but something that's kind of built on lived experience and thinking about issues of representation and thinking about kind of your personal relationship with language and the materials that you're kind of translating, and also thinking about the role of a translator as like a curator, as someone who has like a responsibility in terms of who they translate, how they translate it.
And at the start of your book, you talked about the beauty of the poetry, but you had a passage that I thought was really riveting and memorable. And one of the sentences you wrote was, you mentioned that being an immigrant in the diaspora can often feel like drifting in a vast ocean with no shorelines in sight. And I'm wondering, would you like to elaborate on that? Like I was curious when I read that, why does it feel like there's no firm ground to stand on when you're kind of living as an immigrant in the diaspora?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's kind of based on my kind of own personal experience. The quote is from the very beginning of the book, and it's excerpted from a longer personal essay about how I kind of got into translation and my relationship with Chinese poetry. And I personally feel that because I, as an immigrant, moved a lot when I was growing up, um, in China alone, I think I lived in like 4 or 5 different cities.
Wow.
And I also have lived in Vancouver, I have lived in the US, I've lived in the UK. So in a way, I felt like I was not kind of permanently attached to one place or one identity. And diaspora itself, it becomes like an identity instead. And so in a way, I felt like I was kind of drifting a lot. And in Chinese, we also have words connected to kind of people who are like drifters, people who are kind of migrants and away from kind of their hometown. So I kind of wanted to use that kind of water imagery.
And I'm also curious about your cultural background or sexual orientation or gender identity, and how all of that might come together and inform your poetry as a writer.
Yeah, so I definitely draw on, I think, my kind of language skills when I'm writing my own work. And I've been kind of experimenting with thinking about kind of how my kind of bilingual skills and my knowledge of Chinese as well as Chinese literature can kind of inform and expand on and kind of offer new kind of possibilities for innovation with my kind of work in English. And I also identify as asexual and aromantic, as well as genderqueer. So often I also think about different kinds of relationships beyond just kind of romantic or sexual ones, but other kinds of kind of queer relations and kind of themes around kind of found family. And I try to write about these as well. And I also consider this when I'm translating. So one of the poets, Cho Jing, the feminist poet, at the beginning of the book, I took an approach when I was translating her work where I kind of queered the translations.
And the word Chinese can mean many things to many people. It could be a language, it could be a nationality, an ethnicity, or a race, or there's cultural, spiritual aspects, to the word. And I'm wondering what you identify most with when you think of the word Chinese or you hear the word Chinese.
Yeah, I guess this one is like really hard to say because Chinese itself can mean so many different things, and I don't necessarily want to essentialize either about kind of
Yeah. Well, Sammy
identity.
Sammy
Yeah,
Chin, the artist, he says it's a complicated word.
yeah, it is a very, very complicated word, both in English and in Chinese. Do we mean the
Yeah.
country? Do we mean the language? Yeah, do we mean the ethnicity? And so for me, I don't know, it's still like a question maybe that I'm kind of asking myself and I'm trying to kind of answer through my work as well. Um, I, in a way, relate more to words like maybe the specific province and city I'm
Mhm.
from, because oftentimes a lot of Chinese cultural identity is not kind of identifying as Chinese, but kind of the specific locale. Um, so I
Do you want to talk about
about
where you're
Sudanese,
from in China, like which
Yeah.
province, and maybe what kind of characteristics it might have, or things to help people understand, so we don't think about China as a monolith, because I think that's a real problem that we have in the West.
Yeah, so I am from Sichuan, and it's the province that's known for its pandas, its spicy food, such as hot pot
We
and
all love Sichuan
tofu.
food.
Yes, and it's also kind of my hometown specifically is the kind of the first city closest to kind of the start of the Yangtze River.
Mhm.
So it's kind of like a mountainous region with like some plateaus and like lots of kind of bodies of water. Um, and I think oftentimes when people hear like Chinese in North America, they might think about like Hong Kong or maybe sometimes Taiwanese or like Guangdong. And so those of us who live in like other smaller provinces or provinces that are just less well known, sometimes people don't understand what it's like and how different the kind of food or customs or kind of culture can be.
And did growing up in Sichuan give you maybe a greater appreciation for the environment, for instance, if it had all these bodies of water and everything else?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I feel like very like a close connection to like the river and the water. So I kind of like it in Vancouver because in a way we're also kind of by the ocean. And that's something that I kind of like about the landscapes, how they're kind of similar in that way.
Well, this is wonderful, Elin. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your book or your writing or your translation work?
Um, I if folks are interested in checking out the Lantern the Night Moth, it's available through local bookstores. including Massey Books. And yeah, otherwise, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today. And I've really enjoyed it. I've been speaking with Yilin Wang. She's the author of The Lantern and the Night Moths, 5 Modern and Contemporary Chinese Poets. And she will speak about translation on October 25th at the Vancouver Writers' Fest.